Let's go ahead and open up the terminal. So from our Raspbian desktop, at the top left, you'll see the terminal icon. Just go ahead and click on it, and that should fire up our terminal. And before we get into the discussion of commands, there is one concept I'd like to cover, and that is the notion of user modes. So in Linux, there are basically two user modes that you can work with. One is a user mode that has basic access and privileges, and the other is a mode with administrator access, or you could think of it as super user or root access. So by default, we are logged into the Raspberry Pi as the Pi user. So if you notice in our terminal, we will see the user Pi at Raspberry Pi, and that tells us that now we would be executing commands as the Pi user. There are certain commands that we may run that require advanced privileges. As an example, we can get to the Raspberry Pi configuration by typing in raspi-config. But if you notice here, if I try to run that command, it tells me that this must be run as a root user, meaning you need advanced privileges to run this. The Pi user by itself doesn't have that particular access that's needed to run that command. So in order to execute that command, I need to type in sudo before I run the command. And you will frequently see this as we are running through some of the examples. But sudo tells Linux that I would like to run this command as a super user or as a user with advanced privileges. So if I type in sudo raspi-config and hit enter, then it actually allows me to run that command, and now I see the configuration interface. But essentially, to open it up, I had to type in sudo before the command to run it as a super user. Another thing that you can do is, if you don't want to type in sudo every time, you can type sudo su, and this essentially switches you to the root user. And how you know that you're in the root user mode is if you check at the prompt, you're going to see root here as the user that you're executing commands as, and at Raspberry Pi. And this really indicates that at this point in time, anything that you run would be run as the root user with advanced privileges. So from here, I can just type in the raspi-config command as we saw earlier, and it will be able to execute that command without me having to type sudo in here. So that's another way that you could run commands with super user or advanced privileges. You have to be careful about this though, because the sudo there is in place for us so that we don't make mistakes. And you could think of it as intentionally you want to type in sudo before a command if you're trying to do something that could affect your operating system. So it's best to leave the user running as the Pi user and to type in sudo before the commands that you want to execute in advanced privileges mode, just as a safety mechanism, so that you are indicating you're going to intentionally run a command with advanced access that's needed. So that's just a little tidbit and a tip about users on the Linux operating system.